Why does an avoidant act like you don't matter when you know they care? Your effort gets met with indifference. Your vulnerability gets met with distance. Your love gets met with irritation. The avoidant in your life acts like your presence is a chore. Messages sit unread for hours or get one-word replies. Plans get canceled with vague excuses. When you express concern or affection, their tone shifts to irritation, as if you're demanding something unreasonable just by existing in their space. Everything about their behavior communicates one clear message. You don't matter to them. What you're seeing on the surface tells a completely different story than what's happening internally. An avoidant doesn't lose interest or stop caring when they start acting cold. Their internal experience is actually the opposite. The more they care, the more threatening that caring feels to their sense of safety and autonomy. Connection starts feeling like suffocation. Intimacy registers as vulnerability they can't afford. Every text you send, every expression of affection, every attempt to get closer activates an alarm system in their body that screams, "Too much, too close, need space now." This isn't a conscious choice they're making to hurt you. Their nervous system responds to increasing emotional closeness the way someone else's might respond to a physical threat. The danger isn't real, but their body experiences it as real. When you share something vulnerable, when you express affection, when you try to deepen the connection, their system floods with discomfort that feels urgent and overwhelming. The only way they know to manage that discomfort is to create distance, and that distance shows up as the cold, dismissive behavior you're experiencing. Avoidants often have no idea they're doing this. They don't recognize their own behavioral shifts because, from their perspective, they're just responding to feeling overwhelmed. They might genuinely believe they're being reasonable when they cancel plans or take hours to respond to messages. The internal pressure they feel to create space is so strong that the actions they take to get that space seem justified and necessary. They're not thinking about how their behavior impacts you because all their focus is on managing their own discomfort. Their irritation isn't about you being difficult or demanding. It's their emotional response to feeling trapped or pressured, even when no actual pressure exists. A simple, "How are you?" text can trigger this feeling because it represents emotional engagement they're not ready to handle. An expression of missing them can feel like a demand for reciprocation they can't meet. Vulnerability can feel like an invitation to intimacy that overwhelms their capacity. None of this is logical or fair, but it's what's happening in their internal world. Most people assume that when someone acts indifferent, it means they don't care. That assumption makes perfect sense because typically, people show care through attention, responsiveness, and engagement. Avoidants break that normal equation. They can care deeply while simultaneously acting like they don't care at all. The caring is what creates the overwhelm that leads to the distancing behavior. It's a completely backwards dynamic that makes no sense unless you understand what's driving it. Their actions communicate rejection even when rejection isn't what they feel. They might genuinely want connection with you while also desperately needing space from you. Both things exist at the same time, creating the confusing push-pull dynamic that defines relationships with avoidance. When they're at a comfortable distance, they can access their feelings for you and even reach out. When you're too close or the intimacy feels too intense, those same feelings become the source of their discomfort, and they need to retreat. The intensity of their withdrawal often matches the intensity of the intimacy that preceded it. A weekend spent together might result in days of unavailability afterward. A vulnerable conversation might lead to emotional shutdown. A declaration of feelings might trigger complete distancing. The pattern reveals itself clearly when you look at what happens after moments of genuine closeness. The closer you get, the harder they pull away. Because the closeness itself is what creates the overwhelm they're trying to manage. Recognizing this dynamic helps explain their behavior, but doesn't solve the fundamental problem. You still need consistent emotional presence and connection. They still struggle to provide that without feeling threatened and overwhelmed. Understanding why they act cold doesn't change the fact that coldness hurts and prevents genuine intimacy from developing. Knowledge gives you clarity about what's happening, but clarity alone doesn't create the relationship you need or deserve. You're probably wondering how someone can want connection but reject it simultaneously. The answer lies in how they experience emotional intensity. For most people, increasing closeness feels good, even if it brings some vulnerability or uncertainty. For an avoidant, increasing closeness triggers a sensation of losing themselves. Their boundaries start feeling permeable. Their independence feels threatened. Their sense of self starts blurring into the relationship. This sensation is deeply uncomfortable, and their instinct is to pull back hard to re-establish those boundaries and reclaim their sense of autonomy. The paradox becomes even more confusing when you consider how they function in other areas of life. At work, with friends, in casual interactions, they might seem perfectly capable of connection and engagement. They maintain friendships, handle professional relationships, participate in social activities without obvious difficulty. This makes their coldness toward you feel even more personal and intentional. If they can show up for everyone else, why not for you? The difference isn't about your importance to them. It's about the level of emotional vulnerability required. Casual connections don't trigger the same threat response because they don't demand the same depth of intimacy. Romantic relationships, or any relationship involving significant emotional investment, operate in a completely different category for avoidance. These connections require ongoing emotional availability, vulnerability, and interdependence that casual relationships don't demand. The stakes feel higher, the potential for hurt feels more real, the loss of autonomy feels more threatening. Everything that makes romantic connection meaningful to most people makes it overwhelming to someone who experiences closeness as a threat to their independence and sense of self. Every relationship requires some loss of absolute independence. Two people building intimacy means accommodating another person's needs, making compromises, being influenced by someone else's emotions and preferences. For an avoidant, these normal relationship requirements feel like giving up essential parts of themselves. What you experience as sharing life together, they experience as invasion of their personal space and loss of control over their own life. This fundamental difference in how connection feels explains why they can seem so resistant to things that feel natural and positive to you. The specific behaviors that signal "I don't care" are actually their way of re-establishing control and creating the space they need to feel okay. When they don't respond to messages promptly, they're not thinking, "I don't care about this person." They're thinking, "I need to not be engaged in this conversation right now," or they're simply avoiding the discomfort of emotional engagement. When they cancel plans, they're not rejecting you personally. They're responding to feeling overwhelmed by the commitment or the anticipated emotional intensity of spending time together. Communication breakdowns happen frequently in these dynamics because what you need and what they can tolerate exist on different scales. You might need reassurance, consistent contact, emotional availability, and shared experiences to feel secure in the relationship. These are normal, healthy relationship needs. For an avoidant, meeting these needs consistently feels like constant emotional labor that drains their resources and threatens their autonomy. They're not trying to deprive you or punish you. They genuinely don't have the capacity to show up in those ways without feeling overwhelmed and needing to withdraw. The mismatch creates a painful dynamic where your reasonable requests for connection feel like impossible demands to them, and their need for space feels like abandonment to you. Neither perspective is wrong. Both are valid experiences of the same situation. But validity doesn't create compatibility. Two people can both be right about what they need and still be fundamentally mismatched in their capacity to meet each other's needs. This is what makes relationships with avoidance so difficult. It's not about bad intentions or lack of caring. It's about incompatible nervous systems trying to find a middle ground that satisfies both, which often doesn't exist. Physical presence doesn't guarantee emotional availability. An avoidant can be sitting right next to you and still be completely unavailable emotionally. They're physically there, but mentally and emotionally somewhere else, creating distance even in the same room. This kind of withdrawal is harder to name and address than physical absence because it looks like they're present and engaged when they're actually doing the opposite. You feel the disconnection but can't point to concrete evidence of what's wrong, which makes you question your own perception. Avoidants often treat your needs as demands because that's genuinely how those needs register to them. You might simply express that you'd like to see them more often, which feels like a reasonable request. To them, that same statement can feel like pressure to sacrifice their autonomy, give up their free time, and commit to more intimacy than they're comfortable with. The emotional response they have is disproportionate to what you actually said, but it's based on how the request feels to them internally, not on the objective reasonableness of what you asked for. Their tone shifts to annoyance or irritation because they're managing internal tension. When you reach out after they've been distant, you're unknowingly asking them to re-engage emotionally before they've had enough space to feel safe doing so. The irritation isn't about you or your specific words. It's a signal that they're still in their distancing phase, and contact is asking them to shift back toward connection before they're ready. They can't explain this to you, and often don't even understand it themselves, so it just comes across as them being annoyed with you for no good reason. The coldness you experience serves a protective function in their internal world. By acting indifferent, they create emotional distance even if physical distance isn't possible. By being unresponsive, they control the pace and intensity of interaction. By showing irritation, they discourage you from pushing for more engagement. All of these behaviors work together to give them the space and control they need to feel stable, even though they devastate you in the process. What makes this so painful is that you know they're capable of warmth. You've experienced their interest, their affection, their engagement. That version of them exists, but that version only feels safe to them under certain conditions, usually when emotions aren't too deep yet, or when enough distance exists that they don't feel threatened by the closeness. As intimacy deepens and the relationship becomes more real, those conditions stop being met, and their protective behaviors kick in. Avoidants rarely explain what they're feeling, because they often don't have clear awareness of it themselves. They just know they feel uncomfortable, pressured, or overwhelmed. They might tell themselves you're being needy or demanding when you're actually being perfectly reasonable. They might convince themselves they need a break from the relationship when what they actually need is to process their feelings about increased closeness. Their narrative about what's happening usually doesn't match reality, but it's the narrative that makes sense to them based on what they're experiencing internally. The relationship operates in a cycle where they get close, feel overwhelmed, pull away, feel better, get close again. When they pull away, it looks and feels like they don't care. When they come back, it seems like they do care. This inconsistency isn't manipulation, even though it can feel manipulative. It's them cycling through their tolerance for intimacy. They reach their limit, need space, recover their equilibrium, and then have capacity for closeness again until they hit that limit once more. You're left trying to figure out which version is real, the warm, engaged person or the cold, distant one. The answer is both versions are real. They're both authentic expressions of the same person at different points in their cycle of managing emotional intensity. The warm version shows up when they feel safe. The cold version shows up when they feel overwhelmed. Neither is fake, but neither is the complete picture of who they are or what they're capable of in relationship. Their behavior isn't about your worth or your value as a partner. This same cycle would happen with anyone who tried to build intimacy with them. The specific triggers might differ, the timeline might vary, but the fundamental dynamic would show up regardless of who they're with. You could be perfect in every way that matters, and they'd still hit their threshold for closeness and need to create distance. The problem isn't you being too much, it's them having a very limited capacity for emotional intimacy before discomfort sets in. Most avoidants genuinely want relationships. They want connection, partnership, and love. They're not trying to be alone forever or avoid relationships entirely, but they want these things on terms that feel safe to them, which usually means maintaining significant autonomy, having lots of personal space, and keeping emotional intensity at moderate levels. When a relationship starts requiring more than those preferred conditions, their behaviors shift to try to restore what feels comfortable to them, and those behaviors are what you're experiencing as indifference and coldness. The disconnect between what they want intellectually and what they can actually tolerate emotionally creates constant internal conflict. They might know logically that relationships require compromise, vulnerability, and emotional presence. They might even want to be able to show up that way. But when it comes to actually doing those things, their system resists. The discomfort wins. The need for space and control overrides their logical understanding and their genuine desire for connection. What you're dealing with isn't fixable through better communication or changed behavior on your part. You could be less needy, more independent, perfectly accommodating, and they'd still cycle through this dynamic because it's about their internal tolerance for intimacy, not about anything you're doing wrong. The only thing that changes this is them recognizing the issue, understanding how they're responding to closeness, and actively working to expand their capacity for intimacy. That work is internal and requires them to confront deeply uncomfortable feelings rather than just creating distance to avoid those feelings. An avoidant who acts like you don't matter is actually showing you exactly where their limit is for emotional closeness. They've reached the point where continued engagement feels threatening to their sense of self, and they're responding by pulling back in every way possible. The colder they act, the more overwhelmed they actually feel. The more indifferent they seem, the more their internal alarm system is telling them they've gotten too close and need to retreat. It's completely backwards from what their behavior suggests, but it's what's actually happening. Understanding this doesn't make it hurt less. Knowing they care while experiencing behavior that says they don't creates its own kind of pain. You're stuck in a situation where you can see both the truth and the contradiction, and neither knowledge makes the coldness feel better. The real question isn't whether they care. It's whether someone who cares but consistently acts like they don't is someone you can build a relationship with. That answer depends entirely on whether they're aware of this dynamic and actively working to change it, or whether they're just cycling through it unconsciously while you absorb the impact of their distancing behaviors. Their ability to change depends on recognition and commitment to doing things differently. Some avoidants reach a point where they recognize how their responses to intimacy create problems in their relationships. They see the cycle, understand their role in it, and actively work to stay present through discomfort instead of automatically creating distance. This kind of change requires consistent effort and usually professional support because it involves confronting deeply uncomfortable sensations and choosing connection even when every instinct says to retreat. Without that recognition and active work, the cycle continues indefinitely. They'll keep reaching their threshold for closeness, pulling away to manage their discomfort, recovering enough to re-engage, and repeating the process. Each cycle reinforces the behavior because creating distance successfully reduces their overwhelm, which makes it the go-to response whenever intimacy feels too intense. You become caught in a relationship defined by their capacity limits rather than mutual connection and growth. The avoidant in your life might care deeply. They might think about you constantly when you're apart. They might genuinely value the relationship. But if their response to all of that caring is to treat you with indifference and coldness whenever the intimacy feels too intense, then what they feel internally doesn't translate into the kind of relationship most people need. Care that can't be consistently expressed or received becomes invisible. Love that triggers withdrawal instead of closeness doesn't build the kind of connection that sustains partnership. Understanding why they act this way gives you clarity, but it doesn't give you a functional relationship. So when an avoidant acts like you don't matter, they're actually showing you the limits of what they can currently offer in relationship. The behavior isn't about you. It's about them reaching their capacity for emotional closeness and needing to create distance to feel okay again. Whether they care doesn't change the fact that their way of managing care is to act like they don't. That's the reality you're navigating, and understanding the reason behind it is just the first step in deciding what you do with that information. If you've experienced this dynamic with an avoidant, leave a comment sharing what that's been like for you. If this video helped clarify what's actually happening behind the cold behavior, hit that like button and subscribe for more content on understanding relationship dynamics. Thanks for watching.